Hey everyone, my name is Paul. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Epic. I just want to let you know today, I love chicken wings. I love chicken wings, and I love them deep fried. And so it was this love for deep fried wings that led me to find myself one day staring at a deep fryer engulfed in flames. And so if you're not one of the few, the proud, the unbelievably stupid, who have set a deep fryer on fire, let me tell you this, that when you're staring at a deep fryer that is shooting flames out of it, you have a certified mess on your hands, all right? This is officially, you are in a mess. This is exactly the scenario I found myself in. It was during my senior year of college. I had a bunch of friends over. We were to hang out. We were going to make our own chicken wings. I was in charge of making the sauce. I love making my own sauces. So one of my friends convinced his dad to let us borrow his deep fryer, which was mistake number one. I will say this, not many of us should honestly own deep fryers. Like, you should have a license to own a deep fryer. 2, don't let anyone borrow your deep fryer, all right? And then 3, definitely don't let a group of college guys borrow your deep fryer. So we set up the deep fryer outside in the back of our house in the parking lot, and I will let you know right now, that's the only smart decision that we made that entire day. So there are a lot of dumb decisions in this, and including in turning the temperature way higher than it needed to be, and we left it unattended for a while, which I looked up on Google this week, like what to do and what not to do with the deep fryer. It says all of those things. Do not do those things. And so at one point while I'm making my sauces, I look outside and there's a pillar of smoke coming out of the deep fryer. And so I yell down to the guys, I'm like, hey, I think there's something wrong with our deep fryer right now. And everybody runs out, and indeed, there was something wrong, and it's things on fire. And so when you find yourself in a mess, like staring at a deep fryer that's on fire, you should know that there are several options that will make the problem way worse. You only have a few good options in front of you, but there are several that will make it way worse. So we thought at one point, hey, let's cut off the oxygen. So, again, if you actually look up this up on Google, they'll tell you put a metal sheet or something metal over top of your oil or grease fire. My roommate ran downstairs into the basement and grabbed an extra piece of drywall that we had lying around. Runs upstairs with that. He's like, I got it. And he puts it down onto the deep fryer, and then there's just like this minute where the chaos turned to quiet, and we're like, do you think the fire's gone? And so after about a minute, we decide, okay, we're going to lift up the piece of drywall and see if the fire has gone out. So a bunch of things happened like really in quick succession at that point. First of all, we found out that yes, indeed, the fire is still alive and well. Secondly, the heat from the deep fryer had actually bonded that piece of drywall to the deep fryer. And so when we lifted the piece of drywall off to check to see about the fire, the whole thing just came with it. So the deep fryer knocks over, oil everywhere, fire everywhere, death everywhere. Now, just kidding. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Eventually, the fire just died out. Like I said, the only smart decision we made all day was to put it in the parking lot. So our house was safe. The deep fryer, though, was destroyed. Friend's dad was not happy about that, but you know what? I put that on him for the reasons I've already mentioned. The point is, when you find yourself in a mess, hey, there are a lot of ways that you can make that mess messier. A lot of ways. And that's what we're talking about today, how to not do that. And so we're in a series called Address the Mess, and we have established that we have all made a mess or have been in a mess at some point. We know messes when we see them because we've been in one. And really, we're all a decision away from another mess. So you may be finding yourself in a mess right now, a mess that you've made, a mess that you haven't made. Maybe it's a decision or a series of decisions that have put you in a bad spot. Maybe it's a money mess. Maybe it's a marriage mess. Maybe you've lost your job and that's making a mess. Maybe it's a dispute that you've had a hard time resolving and that has been making a mess. And just like with that deep fryer, every single mess you find yourself in comes with some really bad options. It comes with some bad options. And so we can make any mess that we're in messier than it already is. And I don't want us to do that. And so today I want to help us identify some of those bad options that exist to make us aware of those options. Because I want you to know this, you don't have to make your mess messier. You can make something else. And I want you to know that in any mess that you find yourself in now or in the future, God is always, always, always inviting us to make something better, to make something good, to make something beautiful out of our mess. So for as many bad options that exist, there's always at least one option that will make your mess better. And so we're going to see what we can learn from a guy in Scripture who finds himself at the same intersection we all find ourselves in at some point, where we can make a mess messier or we can make something else. And so this guy's name is David. He goes on to become one of Israel's most famous, most cherished kings. And before he ever became king, he has to go through some stuff. And so if you're ever interested, you can find his story in the Old Testament. It's in the book of 1 Samuel. He's chosen to be king when he's just a teenager. He's working for his dad as a shepherd. And so God chooses him to be king. But the problem is that there's already a king in place. And that king's name is King Saul. And King Saul hadn't lived up to his end of the bargain as king. So God has chosen to replace him now with David. And the thing is that David knows that he's going to be king at some point, somehow. He just doesn't know exactly how or exactly when. And so you'll just see David kind of always try to just do the next right thing. That's kind of his path early on, just doing the next right thing. So maybe you've heard of the story of David and Goliath. That there's an enemy army facing the Israelites, and one of the men in that army, his name is Goliath. He's this huge guy, and so he's challenging someone in the Israelite army to fight him. Nobody wants to do it. Everybody's terrified. David, just this kid, hears about it. He decides to go out there, and again, if you know the story, you know what happens. He takes a sling and then kills him with the sling, and David goes from a nobody to a celebrity overnight. So once everyone hears about this, they go nuts. His popularity is rising. And so King Saul, the more that David becomes popular, King Saul becomes threatened by David. I think that's kind of obvious. So he sees in David the primary threat to his throne, the primary threat to his line continuing. So Saul begins to listen to the worst parts of himself. His jealousy, his insecurity, his fear. And so he tries to do all of these things to keep David under control. And so one of the things that he tries, he actually marries David off to his daughter. And his thought process is that he can try to control and manipulate David that way. Problem is that Saul's daughter, Michal, she actually falls in love with him genuinely, and so she refuses to go along with any of Saul's plans. Then Saul thinks, well, maybe I can use my son, Jonathan, to kind of work everybody against David and to do that way. The problem is Jonathan loves David so much, they become BFFs. And Jonathan refuses to take part in any of Saul's plans. So this is kind of the story of David and Saul. Everybody loves David. Everybody loves him. And Saul gets more and more and more frustrated and more desperate. And after a while, he can't take it anymore. Instead of just trying to control him, he tries to kill him. And it gets so bad that David is forced to go on the run. And so he has to hide out in the wilderness, in the desert, in the mountains, and he's just trying to stay one step ahead of Saul, constantly hiding. He's living like a fugitive, constantly hiding, never comfortable. And so David lives like this, like a fugitive on the run in the wilderness for 3 years. 3 years. And so what I want to draw your attention to about this is that he has done only the right thing this whole time. He's only ever done the right thing. He's done nothing wrong. He hasn't done anything to deserve being punished or being hunted down. And so I don't know about you, but if it's me, I think probably about a month in, I would have already started to question God's goodness and God's plan and where is God in all of this. And so it'd be so easy for David to think this, like, hey, God, what is going on? What have I done to deserve this? At what point are you going to actually start to make things right for me? And so David finds himself in a mess, and here's the rub. It's not even his fault. He finds himself in a mess that he did not make. It's not his fault. It's somebody else doing something to him, and he's about to come across a really pivotal, crucial moment in his life, and we're going to pick up the story here. This is 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, so Saul gave up the hunt temporarily to fight off some of the Philistines. He was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul rallies up, took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. And so Saul's very serious here. This is not a small search party. He's taking 3,000 men, and he's like, David's going to be dead by the end of this. Let's make sure of that. And it says he came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. I just want to stop here for a minute. So if you are, this is one of the few spots in the Bible that talks about going to the bathroom. So if you are a middle school student, or if you have a middle schooler at home, or you are a middle schooler at heart, you're welcome. This passage is for you. So I actually think this is very important. Like, I think to myself, I see this, I'm like, is it a number one? Is it a number two? These are the important questions that I want to know. I'm concerned about the important questions. Now, actually, there's a bit of the debate about whether this actually means that he was relieving himself. So the translation is more like he covered his feet. King Saul went in and covered his feet. So some scholars believe that this means that King Saul went into the cave to sleep, to cover his feet while he sleeps. He's going in there to sleep. But some scholars believe that this is a euphemism for, and I quote, emptying his belly. I spent way too much time researching this. Way too much time. But let it be said, I care about getting this right. In any case, I'm going to let you decide. Is he going to the bathroom? Is he going to sleep? I don't know. Either way, he's in a very vulnerable spot. And then look at what it says. David and his men were far back in the same cave. What are the odds? So, ladies and gentlemen, you would think that David has just had a gift from God dropped into his lap. And actually, everybody who's with David thinks the same thing. So the men that are with him said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So they're saying, this is it, right? Saul's right there for the taking. One slash of your knife, like one blow, and you're finally going to be king. After everything Saul has put you through, you're finally going to be king. Do it. Now is your chance. The tables have been turned. It's time. So it says David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And so the reason he does this is not exactly clear, but I think to myself, this is probably him. Maybe it's one step in a multi-step process where maybe he's going to cut off the robe and then show it to Saul before he kills him. I think actually that David's getting a little cocky here, and that this is too easy. Like, it's actually too easy, and so he's showing off a little bit. And so rather than just killing Saul right away, he cuts off a piece of his robe, and he's going to go back and show it to his boys and be like, look at this. Like, here we go. But the second that he cuts the robe, David runs into a problem, and it's not an external one. It's actually an internal one. It says, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of Saul's robe. So his conscience objected. An alarm went off for him. A red flag went up, and he goes back to his men, and he explains to him his thought process. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, which is King Saul, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So he's saying, God forbid that I lift a finger against King Saul. He is God's appointed king right now, and he says this because God has indeed promised David that he'd be wearing the crown someday. But God did not say that he'd be murdering the king to get it. And this is important because I think we find ourselves in this place a lot. Like, we kind of generally know where God is leading us. We don't know exactly how or exactly when or exactly the way, right? But David knows that this definitely is not the way. And I think sometimes that's all the clarity that we need is this is definitely not it. This is not God's way. This is not God's timing. Something inside him, something was going off. There were alarms going off and said, this isn't right. And David persuades his men not to touch King Saul, and he lets King Saul leave the cave unharmed. And Scripture tells us that as Saul was preparing to leave the area, David actually comes out of the cave. So he emerges from the cave and reveals himself to Saul and his army. And so here's the thing. The second that Saul sees David coming out of that cave, you've got to know that Saul knows exactly what just happened. Or more accurately, what did not just happen. Like, Saul knows that he was completely vulnerable in that cave. He knows that David was in that cave, and if he wanted to, David could have killed him, but he didn't. And then what David does and says next is so fascinating. So David, when he walks out, I mean, think of all the things that he could say. He could be like, hey, what's wrong with you? But he actually says, my Lord the King. And then he bows down in honor of King Saul. And then he does say, why do you keep believing the people who tell you that I wish you harm? And then he says this, I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. David points out, hey, you've been trying to kill me. You've been trying to do everything to make my life miserable. But please know this, even still, I do not wish you any harm. It says, may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you. But my hand shall. So that's God's job. You know what? Vengeance, all that stuff, that's God's job. I'm going to leave that up to him. But my hand is not going to touch you. I'm not going to lift up my hand against you. Vengeance is not my job. And he follows this up by quoting a proverb. And he says, as the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness. In other words, wickedness breeds wickedness. Violence breeds violence. Vengeance breeds vengeance. It's a cycle. And so at some point along the way, David has learned this wisdom from a proverb. The same way that we kind of sit here and we read Scripture, David has gotten this wisdom from Scripture. It says, from the wicked comes the wicked. Right? And so it's enough in this moment when he's in this mess where he could decide to do anything to ding his conscience when he's tempted to pay back evil for evil. So David, in his mess, a mess that someone else created for him, was presented with some bad options that would make his mess messier. But David's conscience dings him, and this wisdom that he's been taught reminds him that if he chooses vengeance in this mess, vengeance is going to tell the story from this point on. And I want you to think about, what is the story that David would have if vengeance tells it at this point? So I will tell you this, if he kills King Saul, David will become king. That's true. And most likely, he could just walk out after that and say, hey guys, I just killed King Saul. And everyone would be like, okay, good. It's about time. Now, he would have been justified to do that after all that King Saul has done to him, and God has already anointed David to be king. He could have done this. But consider this, down the road, when David's children ask him, hey, Dad, could you tell us the story of how you became king? And David says, okay, kids, come on. Everybody gather around. Come on, sit on my lap. It's story time. Here's how I became king, kids. Your grandfather, which, by the way, Saul is these kids' grandfather. David married Saul's daughter, so he's his father-in-law. This is his grandkids. He would say, hey, your grandfather, the king, he was in a dark cave going to the bathroom. And then when he didn't expect it and he couldn't see it, I snuck up behind him and I slit his throat. And that's how I became king. Kids, aren't you proud? Okay. What kind of a story is that? Can you imagine that is the story you have to tell your kids about how you became king? What kind of model or example have you set? And how would you ever rest easy as king, knowing that the way you became king was murdering your father-in-law when he was completely defenseless? So David knew that if he listened to vengeance, he would only perpetuate this cycle of wickedness for wickedness, violence for violence, an eye for an eye. And so he chooses to let Saul walk away, which I need to point this out to you. This is a very important part of the story. Does not work out in the short term. So in that immediate moment when Saul realizes that David has spared his life, Saul says all of the right things. He says, wow, David, you're a better man than I am. You deserve to be king. I'm so sorry that I've done this to you. And they part ways. And then a short time later, Saul gets right back to trying to kill David. And he does that until the end of his life. He does that until the end of his life. David actually has to spare his life again. And so he keeps having to make these little decisions that don't quite work out in the short term, but they're the right decisions. They're the right way forward. And then eventually, it's another 5 years later where Saul is actually surrounded in battle. He's kind of cornered in battle, and he decides to take his own life. And at that point, David becomes king. But for him, it's a long game. You've got to understand that. So he did the right thing, and he did the right thing, and he did the right thing. In the short term, it seemed like it wasn't working out, but eventually, in the long term, he became king, important, in God's way and in God's time. And so while you and I may never find ourselves in a cave presented with the opportunity to kill the king so we can become the king, I guarantee you that we have been in this situation and that you will be in this situation in the future, because we've all been in a mess that someone else has made. Like someone has done something, or right now is doing something to you to mess you up. Like we know that. Some of us are there now. Like we've definitely experienced this, are experiencing this, will experience this. And in those moments, there is going to be a voice that'll be right in your ear telling you some options. And if you listen to it, it's going to drive you right into a bigger mess. And I'll tell you, one of those voices is vengeance. One of those voices is vengeance. And this voice is really sneaky because it pulls all of the right strings. It says to you, you haven't even done anything wrong. Like you have done everything right. That guy did it wrong. That guy did this to you. That guy took advantage of you. And vengeance is going to tell you to do this. Do to others as they have done to you. It might not use those words, but that is exactly what is happening. That's exactly what we're being tempted into when we find ourselves in this kind of situation. To do to others as they have done to you. I mean, we have all been here, right? Like I know that I have been here. Do to others as they have done to you. An eye for an eye, a hurt for a hurt, an insult for an insult. Someone says or does something passive aggressive, I'm going to do it right back. I'm going to let you get away with that. But David refuses to listen to that voice. He refuses to let vengeance tell the story, to do to others as they have done to him. And years later, after that moment in the cave, David could look back and be grateful that he did not take his mess, he didn't take his bad situation and make it worse. And I promise you that if he had listened to vengeance, he would have made it messier. Now, he makes the right decision in that cave that day. The interesting thing is that there are situations, there are messes later on in David's life where he doesn't make that same decision. He actually makes his messes messier. It's the same guy, just different messes, different choices. It's an unfortunate, but honestly for us, it's very informative. And it's really helpful. It's part of the reason why I love the scriptures, because it's messy and it's human and it can teach us so much. So at one point, David is much older now. He's in his 50s, and he's been king for a long time. And he sees a beautiful woman named Bathsheba that he desires. And maybe you've heard this story before, the story of Bathsheba. But he sees this beautiful woman, Bathsheba. She already has a husband. But he calls his servants to go get her, to bring her to him, and he sleeps with her. And he finds out a little bit later that he actually gets her pregnant. And so right now, he's kind of in a bona fide mess. He finds himself in another mess. This time, he's the one who's made it. It's his own decisions. Now, instead of owning up to what he did, instead of admitting that he used his power to manipulate and to take what wasn't his, instead of making things right, he decides to try to cover it up. And he tries to lie. And he tries to manipulate his way out of this situation that he manipulated his way into. And he gets so desperate to cover it up at some point that he ends up having Bathsheba's husband killed. So none of his little schemes or lies or anything else work out. So eventually he just has him killed and then brings her to live with him and thinks that he can cover it all up that way. And he makes his mess so much messier. And he suffers very, very real consequences for those decisions that he made in that mess. And so in the first mess that he found himself in the cave, it was a mess he didn't create. Vengeance was whispering in his voice that, hey, just do this thing. Do this, do unto others what someone has done to you, to make his mess messier. With Bathsheba, David made the mess himself, and there's a different voice this time. It's not vengeance that was tempting him now to make his mess messier. And I want to put words to this voice and to kind of like put some skin and some bones on this idea and this voice, because it is exactly what is happening to us when we find ourselves in a mess. This is the voice that's talking to us. And I think it's helpful to know this, because it's like if you've ever dealt with some weird health problem, or you know someone who's dealt with a weird health problem, and you go to the doctor and they can't figure out what it is. You know what I mean? That's one of the most frustrating things in the world, isn't it? When you know that there's something wrong, but you don't know what it is because you can't fight it. And so until you can name it, until you can see it clearly, you don't know what to do about it. And so today, I want to make sure that when you are in a mess, you can identify exactly what is happening so that you can do something about it. Okay? So one of the voices that we hear is vengeance. Here's the other voice. It's shame. Now, shame is very interesting, because a lot of times we throw guilt and shame together, and I think it's really helpful to make a distinction, because guilt gets a bad rap. It really does. So guilt can actually be your friend. Guilt is when you have done something or failed to do something, and you feel bad or uncomfortable because of it. And here's the difference. Shame is when you've done something or failed to do something, and you feel like you are a failure. And there are some differences here. So guilt is actually good, because guilt is letting you know that you're getting a little off course here. Guilt is letting you know that you've done something and you're off track right now, but it's trying to let you know that you need to get back on track. The difference between shame is shame wants to derail you. Like guilt is letting you know that you're off track so you can get back on track. Shame is just trying to derail you. Guilt sees you headed toward a cliff and it's warning you about it. It's like, hey, if you keep doing this, you're going to go off a cliff. Shame is like, I want you to go off the cliff. See ya. Guilt sees you digging a hole for yourself and it's reaching down to pull you out of the hole. Guilt or shame wants to pull you down to rock bottom and keep you there. So the bottom line is this: shame is not your friend. Shame is not looking out for you. Shame does not have your best in mind, and neither does vengeance, by the way. But shame is so often, so often the voice that we listen to when we find ourselves in a mess. When we find ourselves in a mess, we want to listen to shame. And so here are the three common options that shame tries to tell us to take in our messes. Here's one: to hide or to lie. To hide or to lie. So you've done something wrong, and shame tries to convince you that it's better to just hide it. It's better to lie your way out of it. It could be a tiny white lie. It could be a whole series or a whole network of lies. But what's at the root is that shame wants you to hide a part of yourself or what you've done so that you are isolated, so that you're cut off from what's actually good in your life. So think about it this way: you can't get help, you can't get better, and you can't grow from a mistake or a mess if you're isolated and nobody knows about it. And shame knows that. And shame wants you to have secrets. Shame wants you to stay hidden. Shame wants you in the shadows. Shame wants you in the dark. Because if it can cut you off from other people, it can keep you right where it wants you and is not interested in your growth. So that's one thing that shame does and will tell you to do when you find yourself in a mess. Here's the second thing: to get defensive or blame or deflect. So, and you've been here, right? So when something happens, sometimes our first reaction is not to take responsibility for it or to say, oh man, I am so sorry. I did this thing. I messed up. I was wrong. We want to just blame somebody else. Point the finger, take it out on somebody else. We're not going to own up to it. We're going to make an excuse. We're going to do whatever it takes to take the focus off of me and what I did and how I feel about myself. Whatever will have to keep me from facing all of this, I'll do that. So just deflect, blame somebody else, something else. It's everybody else. It's everything else except for me. And so I want you to remember, when you're a mess, you feel this compulsion to point the finger. Or you feel this compulsion to lash out at someone, to make an excuse, to be passive aggressive. You might actually in that moment be listening to shame. And again, shame is not your friend. It does not have your best in mind. Here's the third thing that I think shame tries to tempt us with: to binge, or what I call to go the scorched earth root. So an example of this is if you've ever been on a tough diet and you've been pretty good for a while, everything's been all right, but then in a moment of weakness, and maybe after a really nice commercial about cupcakes, you slip up. You ate that donut, or you had that cookie or that cupcake, or you drank that Coke, whatever it was, and instead of just saying, man, I messed up, I made a little mistake, that's okay though, I'm gonna get back up, I'm gonna keep on going. Here's what shame tries to tell you to do. Shame will be like, what is the point of all this? What is the point? You messed everything up. You didn't just mess one little thing up, you messed everything up. And then you go nuts and you eat all the donuts, or you eat the entire, everything that's in the pantry or the refrigerator all at once. We've been there, some of us, right? Shame does this to us, though. It tells us, hey, you're a failure. You're never going to be able to do this. You're the worst. Just give up. Burn it all down. Walk away. What's the point anyway? Right? It applies in a lot of other areas too. You've been good about not talking to your ex. You know it's for the best. You know how toxic it was, but then you kind of slip up. You check their Instagram one night, and you're like, oh. Instead of going, okay, you know what, I'm done. This is not good for me. This is whatever. Like you're like, all right, what's the point? I've already messed up anyway. So I'm gonna go. You go full on down the rabbit hole, right? Next thing you know, you're texting him. You're hanging out with him. You wake up next to him. But this is the kind of thing, right? It's not shame. This is one of shame's most destructive options. You need to know this. It takes a small mess. It takes a tiny little mistake that you made, and it doesn't let you stop at just making that mistake. It's not like, oh, I made a mistake. Oh, let me just get back on track. Shame will take that little mess that you made, little mistake you make, and it will convince you to blow it all up and make the biggest mess that you could possibly make, because what's the point? I've seen people destroy their lives because of this. I've seen people walk away from faith because of one mistake they made, and they're like, what's the point of all this? I've seen people walk away from their marriage because they messed up in this one way, and they're like, what's the point anyway? This is what shame does to you, and I need you to know that it is a lie. That anytime shame is whispering your ear, these options, it is a lie. Shame is the worst, okay? Shame is not your friend. If you listen to shame in your mess, you are going to make your mess messier. If you try to hide, if you try to cover up, if you lie, if you deflect, you're going to make your mess messier. If you listen to vengeance, if you do to someone else what they have done to you or what they intend to do to you, violence for violence, you're going to make your mess messier. Every single mess that we find ourselves in has some bad options, and they're going to be right in front of your face. But, there is always a voice that is inviting you to something better. There is always a voice in your mess that is inviting you not to make your mess messier, but to make something better. Earlier in the series, we looked at a passage from the book of John. And Jesus says this, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And I want you to know this, that when you are in a mess, when shame is tempting you to keep things hidden in the dark, Jesus is inviting you into the light. And it actually says it's the light of what? Life. Right? The light of life. And in the letter to the church, John, who also recorded Jesus saying this, it says this, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from where? God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. I love this passage. Later on in the same letter, he says, God is light. So if you need to remember something, if you remember anything, when you are in a mess, when you're in a dark place, when you are confused, when you don't know what to do next, God is love. And God is light. And he is always inviting you into that. So when we find ourselves in a mess and we want to blame somebody or we want to retaliate or we want to hate somebody else or hate ourselves, God is inviting us to love. God is the voice in your ear that is leading you here. To love each other. And that looks like, for some of us, that looks like being honest with your spouse about what's going on. That looks like not manipulating or covering up the situation anymore and continuing to let the people in your life suffer the consequences because you're not facing your problems. It's time to come clean. That's what love looks like. And light looks like. It looks like loving your enemies. It looks like breaking the cycle of violence and vengeance and asking yourself, how can I be loving and good to this person instead of retaliating, instead of doing to them as they have done to you? Jesus says, and this is the actual saying, do to others as you would have them do to you. This looks like listening to God when he tells you over and over and over again that he loves you. That when you've messed up, you don't have to hide. You don't have to run. You don't have to hate yourself. And in your mess, you need to learn to recognize the voice of God, and you need to learn to recognize the voices that aren't God. Because shame is not your friend. Shame is not looking out for you. Shame wants to pull you down to rock bottom. Shame wants you to stay in the dark. Shame wants you to keep secrets. Shame wants you to stay in the shadows because that's where death is. We die there. And that's not God's voice. I'm telling you, that's not God's voice. It's not God's desire for you. It's not where God is leading you. Shame wants to bury us. Jesus wants to bring us to life. Shame wants you to waste away in the dark, and Jesus wants you to come out into the light and grow and thrive there. Shame and vengeance want us to stoop down to the level of our enemies or those who hurt us so we can continue the cycle of shame and vengeance. And so when there's chaos around you, when there's darkness around you, I'm telling you, God sees you even in your mess, and he is telling you, if you are lost out there and you're all alone, a light is waiting to carry you home. Actually, I'm just kidding. That's from Full House. I had you fooled there for a second, though, didn't I? That was pretty good. I'm telling you the truth. I woke up this morning singing the Full House theme song. I have no idea why. I haven't watched the show in decades. And I was singing this morning. I'm like, that kind of fits. It works, though. I mean, feel free to use that. But God is saying to us in our mess, we will make something good out of this mess, I promise you. And God is always, always, always inviting us to light and to love and to life. Do not believe any other voice that tells you otherwise. A little while ago, a friend of mine asked if we could get together and catch up. And so we met up and we had some food, and I had a feeling that it's one of those situations where I felt like he had something that he needed to get off his chest. And so I kind of just let him get there. And so finally he shared with me that his marriage was ending. And so we're both sitting there, and I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken for him. I'm heartbroken for his wife. And so we talked through a lot of this, and I told him, hey, you have a lot of bad options. And it's the exact conversation that we're having here right now. I told him, you have a lot of bad options in front of you right now. A lot of opportunities, like really, really, really easy opportunities to lash out, to hurt this person back, to get even, whatever. But I'm telling you, none of that is going to make this better or fix it. And so the best way through this is going to be to love the other person, to be good to the other person. And I don't know, you might not be able to change their mind. You might not be able to make them stay, but you can love them and you can be good to them. And I promise you that years from now, you look back, you will not regret this. And so last week, he sent me some text messages, and he said, hey, I want to let you know that the greatest thing that anyone said to me is what you told me about being good and loving during this process. It saved me 100 times already. I've wanted to not be a good human and not be loving, but I keep replaying our conversation. And this is the same conversation that each of us is having every time that we're in a mess. There are voices that are going to say, hey, lash out, get back at them, hide, lie, whatever you need to do. And there's a voice that's calling you to something better. So you may find yourself in a mess right now. Maybe it's one that you've made. Maybe it's one that someone else has made for you. But if you try to do unto others as they've done unto you, you're going to make things worse. If you try to retaliate and take it out on someone else, you're going to make it worse. If you try to hide, if you're covering it up, if you try to lie, you're going to make it worse. And so today, you might need to make a decision. And I'm telling, I understand this. It's not easy. It's going to be really hard in the short term. Like you have a mess on your hands and you really want to retaliate. You really want to get back. You really want to hurt someone the way that they've hurt you for everything that they put you through. I get it. But God is saying that's not the way. Trust me, it's not the way. You want it to be the way, and it's not the way. Like vengeance is not the way. You're only going to continue a cycle, and it's going to make your mess messier. So what does it look like today to act with love and goodness toward this person in your mess? And some of you, you might have a secret that you're holding on to. You've done something or you've done a series of things and you've been trying to hide it. And in the process, you've been hiding your true self. Like you're walking around every day not being yourself really because there's something that you're keeping in the dark. There's something that you're keeping in the shadows. And I'm telling you that death lies there. It's not good for you. God doesn't want you to be there. And so it might be so hard. I know it might be so hard to imagine coming clean. Because shame is screaming in your ear right now, don't do it. You can't do it. What will they think if they find out? I'm telling you, in the short term, it might mean that you hurt some people. In the short term, it might mean that some stuff blows up in your face. But in the long term, living in the light is where Jesus wants you to be, and that's where your actual life that you want and you desire is. You're not going to find it in the shadows. And so today, it's going to be the day that I hope that you choose love and life instead of shame and vengeance. And maybe it's just one little step. It might be overwhelming, but maybe you have to just do the next right thing. For some of you, it's just tell somebody, please. If you're hiding something, if you've got a secret, if you've got something that you've been keeping in the dark for a long time, tell someone, please. Shame wants you to be by yourself in this. God's saying, yeah, you don't have to be by yourself. Tell somebody. So God is calling us to life and to love and to light, to be people who, even when we find ourselves in a mess, and we will, we can make something better, and we can make something good, and we can make something beautiful. So when you're in a mess, listen for that voice, the light and the love and the life, and move in that direction. You will not regret it. Let's pray. God, I just thank you so much that no matter what mess we find ourselves in today, no matter what messes we find ourselves in tomorrow, that you've always, always, always been there for us. You are always there for us. You will always be there for us. You are always inviting us, God, to light and to love and to life. And so I pray, God, for any of us who are just stuck in this cycle of vengeance, of hurting each other, God, give us the courage, the wisdom, the love that maybe we feel like we don't have to figure out how do we break this cycle and step into love. God, for those of us who are just weighed down by shame, God, who are in the dark, who are keeping secrets because we're afraid of what's going to happen, God, I pray that you would continue to speak to us. Give us the courage to step out into the light where it's warm and where it's good and where you have good things waiting for us. I pray for courage. I pray for courage. I pray for courage for those of us who need it today. We trust, God, that you're always leading us to love and to light and to life. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.